Hello everybody, I would like to request you to please be seated for session 2. Kindly be seated. Welcome back to session 2 of Universal Ethics for 21st Century. Session 2 is on ethics in everyday, negotiating difference and indifference. I'm Tenzin Dolma, I'm Education Coordinator at Tibet House. I would like to invite our chairperson, Dr. Sanjay Jacobji, Suraj Jacobji. Our speakers are Nidhi S. Subarwal, Deshan Pamula, Mr. Dunu Roy. I would like to request our chairperson and speakers to kindly come on the dais. Dr. Suraj Jacobji is a researcher in political economy and has taught in India and US. He has worked in institution culture that supports openness, pluralism in education. He is presently affiliated with the Azim Premji University, Bangalore, and Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. I would like to request Professor Suraj Jacobji to kindly proceed the session too. Thank you very much.
Welcome to session 2. We have 3 panelists. Let me get straight to briefly introducing them. Dr. Nidhi Sabarwal is with NIPA, the National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, and her current interests have to do with diversity and higher education, on which she'll be speaking today. Previously, she was also the director of the Indian Institute of Dalit Studies. Her interests lie in studying groups and exclusion, caste, class, gender, and so on. In fact, before you start, I'll just read out the last part of the bio which is listed in the book, because as Kaveri mentioned in the previous session, many of these presentations are of particular interest to the youth. Because I think a lot of your work is around stuff that many people in this room are living through. So your current research focuses on college readiness, student diversity, inclusive excellence, social inclusion, and equity in higher education. So please, Nitin.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Kaveri Gill for this opportunity to speak the work that we have been doing at the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education, which is a center at the National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration. Thank you very much, Kaveri, for this opportunity. So my topic is on student diversity and universal ethics. It's on. So my starting point is on the issues of higher education. Currently, the higher education sector in India has experienced an unprecedented expansion in the recent decades. The expansion has been accompanied by diversification of the sector in terms of institution, sources of financing, nature of programs of study offered, and students' background. And that's what I'll be focusing on today. Student diversity is an important aspect of expansion of higher education. So this is a graph from the National Sample Survey Organization. There are 2 rounds of survey that is collected. We clearly see that diversity in terms of social group composition has increased over the years. We find student diversity in terms of their social composition, and this is increasing. The student composition in the campus has become very diverse. There are mixed classrooms today in our higher education institutions. Students from disadvantaged groups are studying with students who are from the privileged backgrounds, women with men, and other religious minorities, and poor students are also gaining access to higher education institutions. The core argument of my presentation is that theories of cognitive development and social psychology provides us the foundation for valuing student diversity as a resource for civic learning as well as practice of universal ethics. Civic learning is a type of learning that includes knowledge and skills to act with empathy, that promotes a culture of peace. This is also the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 4, and the target 4.7. It is on college campuses that young people who are entering adulthood, early adulthood, come together from different backgrounds and experience classroom and social relationships that are in variance from the student's home environment. Such an environment has the potential to promote engagement in a meaningful manner and develop interdependent relationships with diverse others. College campuses are thus viewed in our study as a laboratory for such interactions, and numerical diversity is regarded as a resource for promoting a positive campus environment, intergroup relations, positive learning outcomes, as well as democracy outcomes. We did a large-scale study at the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education. We were asking 3 key questions. What is the extent of diversity in higher education institutions? What are the nature and forms of student experiences in higher education? And what are the institutional policies and strategies to address diversity, student diversity, and support student diversity? The research project employed a mixed method approach. Both quantitative and qualitative data were combined to arrive at research findings. Quantitative data was collected to measure diversity in student groups in the universities and the college campuses and differences between experiences of diverse groups of students, while qualitative data helped us to understand drivers of social exclusion, processes that are involved in causality. There were 3,200 students surveyed, 12 higher education institutions, and in 6 states. We also interviewed teachers and administrators. The key aspect of our study is that this picture displays that we were able to classify stages of diversity and sources to achieve each diversity. One of the important contributions the study is making is the classification of student diversity, which is related to 3 stages. Based on the empirical evidence, we classify the campus diversity in 3 stages. Stage 1 diversity is when we have social diversity, numerically present students in higher education campuses. Stage 2 is about academic diversity, when we are able to overcome disparities and move towards academic diversity in classrooms. I will not be talking on that stage, but what I'll be speaking on is the stage 3 diversity, which deals with the issue of which reflects on the effect of structural diversity, both social and academic, on campus environment, interactions among socially and academically diverse groups, and how student diversity can be considered as a value of inclusion in social and academic life and leveraged for practice of universal ethics. Our study shows that the disadvantaged student group, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes have become majority in higher education campuses. This is a strict implementation. This is a reflection of strict implementation of the reservation policy. However, what we find in terms of faculty composition, it's the reverse. Majority is from the dominant group. Higher caste 61%, other backward classes 23%, scheduled caste 7%, scheduled tribes 2, women constitute 39% in the faculty, while student is the reverse. This is a source of tension that we find in our study, one of the sources of tension. In terms of the kind of experiences that students have on higher education campuses, we find while there is diversity, we do find in which gives us an opportunity to experience richness and variety. It also poses challenges of living in a socially inclusive way. The finding of the study indicate that discrimination continue to exist in higher education campuses. Diversity tends to induce social group identity-based peer group formation and develops divide in social relation based on caste, ethnic, class, linguistic, regional, and religious lines. We also find the views of teachers as negative. Former untouchables in the classrooms are considered as unteachable in the classroom from the study that we found. We have students' peer group formation on the basis of identity, as well as resentment against reservation policy, which is a major thing. We asked one question in our survey, who's your best friend? And this table shows that the first best friend of each group was from their own background, social background. Exclusionary behavior also brings discrimination and physical violence for low caste and women. Hostels are on the basis of caste and ethnicity. Students expressed alienation from the curriculum content, with the dominant culture alienating subaltern culture. Teachers considered diversity as a liability on the campus instead of an asset. Also, we have mechanisms, institutional support mechanisms that are put in place, but what our study found that many of these institutional arrangements do not function effectively. This is primarily due to lack of sensitivity on the part of the faculty members and academic administrators to issues related to diversity and discrimination in higher education in India. Discriminatory practices no doubt alienate students belonging to disadvantaged group and result in social inclusion. Students are left with the feeling of not being welcomed in the institutions, and campuses remain non-inclusive. All these issues pose major challenges for realizing individual potential and achieving inclusive excellence in higher education institutions. So what did we do after this study? We had the results. We've published widely of the results of the study. It's all available on our website. These are our research papers. So we embarked on a campaign, on a sort of a strategy to prepare modules that sensitize faculty members and administrators on this issue and engage in aspects of civic learning and practice of universal ethics. And in preparation of the module, Beyond Religion of His Holiness Dalai Lama has been a major guiding light for the modules that I've prepared. We have prepared modules to sensitize leaders and faculty members to see student diversity as an asset, and how student diversity in Indian higher education can be channeled for civic learning in college campuses. Civic learning for us means an active engagement with values of liberty, equality, and humanity. Three major approaches have been identified to channel student diversity for civic learning and practice of universal ethic, which is within the curriculum and co-curriculum spheres. These broadly are: new knowledge about other groups is included in the curriculum to increase intergroup understanding. contact programs that provides opportunity for members of different groups to interact with each other in controlled settings. Skill programs to manage differences in a peaceful manner and collectively solve common problems. Empirical studies through our literature review, and also I've been engaged with understanding the C learning framework as well. We do find it indicates that diversity of experiences has an impact on active thinking and intellectual engagement, while social diversity, as we have in our higher education campuses, is the first prerequisite for an engagement in this process. It is a necessary condition, but it alone is not enough. Even when students in higher education institutions belong to diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, as we found in our study, diversity is accompanied by tensions in social relations and viewed as a liability. Elements which support effective effects of diversity are namely, these are the elements. They are curricular intervention, that is the content knowledge, which makes students firmly believe in positive values, sensitize them to the problems of society. Pedagogies, which improve skills and competencies for respectful intergroup relations with diverse peers and induce motivation for collective action to address common problems. University community engagement becomes an integral component of pedagogy, where democratic and civic ethos on campuses are fostered through pedagogical methods of community engagement. Furthermore, reflective teachers that creates students' awareness in the knowledge construction process, and proactive, empathetic administration and educational leadership can also play a significant role in preparing students to interact in this 21st century. Empathetic administrative and educational leadership is one whose actions are guided by principles of equity and social justice. I'm going to be ending very soon, but I would like to end with some quotes from Dr. Ambedkar, who has been referred by His Holiness Dalai Lama in his book as well. And there are many parallels that can be drawn between what His Holiness Dalai Lama is writing and what Dr. Ambedkar wrote 50 years back. When citizens unify around a set of democratic values such as equality, humanity, and justice, only then the liberties of social, ethnic, and religious groups can be secured to experience freedom, justice, and peace. Dr. Ambedkar emphasized that education is an instrument that cultivates democracy in the society by providing skills of associated living, which is universal ethics. In other words, fraternity, a sense of common humanity, being one people. Dr. Ambedkar emphasized, we are one people. The principle which gives unity and solidarity to social life. In its absence, liberty and equality could not become a natural course of things. It would require constable to enforce them. Universal ethics, also Dr. Ambedkar, as I interpreted, Dr. Ambedkar considered functioning of moral order, ethics, and public consciousness for fostering fraternity and democracy. And he defined public consciousness as, in his address to the members of Pune District Law Library on 22nd December 1952, he said, democracy is spoken as free government. Free government means that in vast aspect of social life, people are left free to carry on without interference of law, or if law has to be made, then it is expected that society will have enough morality in it to make the law a success. Democracy requires public conscience. Public conscience means conscience which becomes agitated at every wrong, no matter who is the sufferer, and it means that everybody, whether he suffers the particular wrong or not, is prepared to join him in order to get him relieved. This is common humanity and interdependence. cultivation of democracy and providing skills for associated living, and practice of universal ethics are key features of civic learning that we are proposing in our modules. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
We'll move on to the second presentation by Ms. Dechen Pamo. She is with the Tibet Policy Institute in Dharamshala. She's a research fellow there, working on environment and development. Her work at the Tibet Policy Institute is on rivers and their geostrategic importance, and I think it's part of that work that she's going to be presenting today. She did her graduate work in Madras and has participated in many such forums and published widely. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So today's conference on universal ethics has been an issue that has been championed by His Holiness Dalai Lama and other notable personalities. So recently, a 16-year-old girl, which everyone knows, I'm sure, Greta Thunberg, and her commitment towards climate change has been brought a visible change in the conversation with regard to climate change. So therefore, I'm delighted to be able to share this platform with you all, and I'll be speaking on the pertinent issues of Tibetan rivers and their impact on the region beyond Tibetan borders, as well as the concerted effort made by the individuals and groups in Tibet to preserve these rivers. Okay, so this is the outline of my presentation today. First of all, I'll speak briefly on His Holiness works on environment protection, and then I'll go on with the global significance of Tibetan rivers, and third, I'll speak on the impact of climate change on Tibet transboundary river, and then last but not least, I'll give a brief case study on how the individual in Tibet, they are conserving this transboundary waters. So talking about His Holiness works on environment protection. So His Holiness, as everyone knows, that he have awarded Nobel Peace Prize in 1989 in recognition of his non-violent struggle. But beside that, His Holiness is also one of the first person to get recognized for his concern for global environmental problems. And then beside this, even in his three main principal commitments, it also includes protection of Tibet's environment, and then the famous 5-point peace plan, which was proposed in 1979, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, in that famous 5-point peace plan, the fourth point, it consists of protection of Tibet's environment for the not only for Tibetan people, but for the entire all those people who are dependent on the Tibet plateau for their survival. So this is a quote from His Holiness message during COP21 in 2015, and to quote, "This is a blue planet, is our only home, and Tibet is its roof. Tibetan plateau needs to be protected, not just for Tibetans, but for the health and sustainability of the entire world." So Tibetan, His Holiness Dalai Lama, he often calls for Tibetan to do and work for the protection of the environment, and not only for the environment, even in wildlife protection. In 2006, during Kalachakra in South India, when he heard that Tibetan people in Tibet, they are wearing, their increase in smuggling of the wearing of animal skins and all these things. So His Holiness called the Tibetans in Tibet not to wear and to abandon all this wearing of animal skin. So in show of their loyalty towards His Holiness, the people in mostly in like Eastern Kham region, they have gathered and burned all those animal skin. So this is the picture which I've got from the internet. And then like talking about the Tibetan rivers, and So when we talk about the water, water is, like without water no one can sustain, right? So we need to know how much water does earth have and how much we can access. So looking at this graph, we can see that though 75% of earth is covered by water, but out of this 75%, 96.5% is in ocean, which is undrinkable, and the remaining little what we have is 2.5% of fresh water. And out of this fresh water, almost 70% is in form of glaciers and ice. So, but we got only 1.2% of fresh water. And then, when we think about this, as we can see that 68.7% is in glaciers. When we think about the glaciers, what comes in our mind? It is like in talking about the glaciers, the North Pole and South Pole, it comes in the mind, right? Automatically. So I want to put stress that beside North Pole and South Pole, world also have third pole, and that is none other than Tibetan Plateau. So sorry, going back. So Tibetan Plateau, it has an area of almost 2.5 million square kilometer, which is around 2% of Earth's surface. And Tibetan Plateau also has the highest and largest number of glaciers. Highest plateau in the earth, and there were around 100 highest peaks above 7,000 meters. And this, as I've mentioned before, that there were many glaciers, around 46,000 glaciers, which makes around 14.5% of Earth's world total. So when these glaciers melt, as I mentioned before, that when the North Pole and South Pole, they have largest number of glaciers, but when these glaciers melt from the North Pole and South Pole, it goes into ocean, which is undrinkable, right? So when the glaciers on Tibetan Plateau melt, it goes into river, which are the lifeline of millions of people who are dependent on it. So Tibetan, as you can see in the map, there are a number of rivers which flows into different countries, right? There are around 10 different countries, densely populated nation, they are dependent on Tibetan rivers, right? From Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, and all of Southeast Asian, like Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and even China. Those two lifelines of the Chinese civilization are also, this river also have source in Tibetan Plateau. So when talking about how much number of population depend on Tibetan river, out of 7 billion people, 1.5 billion people of the world population are directly or indirectly depend on Tibetan rivers. So if there is any kind of damage to the Tibetan rivers, it will have impact not only in Tibetan Plateau, but have impact all over the Asia in particular. So these are the major rivers which have its source in Tibetan Plateau, and then this we can see on this. Here in watershed region, we can see that there are a number of countries who are dependent on Tibetan rivers. So due to the climate change, which is a global phenomena, the impact which it has on Tibetan Plateau is more than the rest of the world. So talking about the climate change, Tibetan Plateau is warming twice than the global average, which is 0.3 to 0.4%. And due to the warming of temperature and melting of glaciers, all those permafrost and the glaciers on Tibetan Plateau are melting up so fast. So this is the picture of Rongbuk glaciers. First one is taken in 1920 something, and the second one is taken in 2009. So we can see the clear difference, like how much glacier has been melted. So there's one scientist from Chinese Academy of Sciences, Liu Xiaoyin. He has said that the shrinking of glaciers has picked up speed in the past decades. While there might be more water in the rivers at present because of the increased melting, in the long run, water will decrease and drought will follow. So there are many cases that though Chinese government, they are building dams and there are many issues coming up, but as per a case of India, there are many strategies and strategies and scientists, they are saying whatever happens on Tibetan Plateau, it won't have impact on India because of because most of the rivers come from Tibet, all the tributaries comes from India itself. So this is not the case. If there's any kind of and river is also, the flow of the water is also not decreasing, it's increasing it seems, but the perennial, it's the flow of this base water, it comes from Tibet. So if the base itself like get blocked or kind of dried up, then it will have impact obviously. So and there are many studies has been done by different research. The Chinese Academy of Sciences report also, and in IC mode, it's a intergovernmental think tank based in Nepal, and they have brought out many reports stating that around by 2100, 80% of glaciers on the Tibetan plateau will goes away. So this is very dire situation where like it's unthinkable to imagine where how future might look in. So this is the United Nations Environment the United Nations Environment Project. They have brought out that global water scarcity by 2025, how it looks in 2025. As per the United Nations Environment Program, they brought out that around by 2025, 2.8 billion people in 48 countries will face water scarcity. And not only this, as of now, like there were more than 1.1 billion people are living without a clean drinking water. So this is gloomy pictures where like the reality of the today's world, where climate change have impact not only on the one particular nation, it has impact all over the world. So it is now like responsibility of every individual to do something from their side. And His Holiness have rightly said that if the planet is to be sustained, environmental education and personal responsibility must increase. So this is a book which we have Environment and Development Desk of Tibet Policy Institute we published, and we have the collection of statement from His Holiness on environment from 1987 till date. So now talking about the individual responsibility, I want to draw your attention to the one case studies from the Zachu. Zachu is a Mekong River, which widely known as Mekong River. It flows into 6 different countries, from Tibetan Plateau to China, and then to Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, and all these countries. So almost 6 countries, they are dependent on this Mekong River. Then it has source on the Zade and this is the 2 lamas, and who these are the father and son duo. They have taken the initiative to protect this source. So they have formed a Zachu Environmental Volunteer Organization in 2005, and since then they have been working to preserve this source. So Zachu, and this is the source of Mekong River, which is a 12th longest river in the world and 7 in the Asia, 7 longest river. So talking about the source of the Zachu, this source's name is Tashikiwa, means like auspicious source. So by name itself, we can see that how Tibetan consider this source of this river. So Tibetan have been protecting these rivers, and Lama Drupa and Lama Trinle, the father and son duo, they have give teaching about the relationship between how Tibetan Buddhism and environment are interrelated. So, and when asking about his, asking during interview, he told that in general, Tibetan don't think much about water because we have so much. But I traveled to Mongolia last year. That was in 2016. Actually, my mother is also from that same place where this organization have located. And when asking about his view, he told that he have gone to Mongolia in 2016, and he saw people who don't have enough water to take shower. Then he started to realize that how important the water is. And Zate is the source of many rivers. Now now I realized that this area is source of millions of lives. So because of that, like, he have taken this initiative, and from his father he have taken the responsibility to protect this rivers. The family had a long legacy of protecting these rivers. Not only this 14th Dalai Lama, he is an environmentalist, but even 5th Dalai Lama, considering 5th Dalai Lama, it was during 17th century, if I'm not wrong, and he have written a letter to their family, and this is the picture of the letter, and this is a seal of. He said this is a seal of 5th Dalai Lama. He asked my ancestor specifically to look after the source of the Mekong, and my family has been doing this ever since. The 6th and the 7th Dalai Lama has also asked us to do this. So we have continued the work. This is 18 generation ago. So their family have a long legacy of protecting these rivers. And this generation is the first generation. They formed such organization to protect these rivers. And he have also said that my work is not only to protect water for the Tibetans. If this was it, I would have stopped years ago. I do this because there are millions of people in other places who need this water. So Lama Drukpa and Lama Trille and these volunteers, this is Mudup, and these volunteers, they were among the very small number of people who thought the Mekong holistically rather than in terms of localized value. Instead of limiting their thinking to how they could improve the river for their own community, they are looking at the bigger picture, how their action could possibly affect the life of faraway strangers. And he said, we are the ones who are living at the source. If we don't protect it, who will save the source, right? So this question, like a fighting tooth, no one can save, right? If they are not taking the initiative. And he's also a volunteer, and he has been staying there at the source to protect this. He is a guardian of this Hasokongma spring, and he said that we work very hard to keep this clean water for ourselves and for the millions of people who live downstream. And this incident, like when there's one person who have gone there and interviewed these people, and I still have contact with the people who are there in Tibet, and this father and son, because they are the relatives of mine. And then when we asked like why it's necessary for them to keep the guardian over there, because it's a very remote area, and then they told that. Some few years ago, some Chinese tourists came there and they peed in the source and said that I want the 5 countries to drink my urine. So this made this local to keep closer watch over this spring. So he want to convey the message that for the people living downstream is that my family is living this rough life because of this water. If there's no water, we cannot live. So we work very hard to keep the clean water for ourselves and the millions of people who live downstream. And this is by no means an exhaustive presentation of the importance of Tibetan rivers and the work of those who strive to protect it. The central idea behind my presentation today has been to emphasize the universality and the interdependence nature of 2 things. One being the significance of Tibetan ecology to the world at large and its impact on the same. The second being the ethical responsibility that drives these individuals such as Lama Drukpa and Lama Trille towards working to protect the ecological preservation that extend beyond the division created by faith, ethnicities, and borders. Secular ethics, therefore, is truly a universal phenomena that has precedence in all corners of human society and history. It is indeed an ideal to aspire for, and although many see this as utopian, as Kavirila mentioned, that the world is much better place having a utopian ideal to work towards than having none at all. Thank you.
We'll move on to the final presentation. It's by Mr. Dunu Roy. His bio is very beautifully written at the back of the booklet, very short. And the first line, worth reading twice, he's a chemical engineer by training, a social scientist by compulsion, and a political ecologist by choice. So I think that itself, you could talk to us 15 minutes about what was compulsion and what was choice.
That's the trouble. Kaveri asked me to present 50 years of work in 15 minutes. It's a little difficult, My memory of this place, as is probably for many of you, is of momos. And I've just received a call from my grandson, who's 4 years old, and he said, bring back momos. So it's very pleasurable to be here inside the Tibetan settlement to talk of things other than momos. And I'm very grateful to the office here, to Tibet House, and to Kaveri for giving me this opportunity to think a bit about, reflect over 50 years. Nivedita introduced a concept of eudaimonia in the morning session, of well-being. It would be useful for some of you to develop a eudometer. It was developed long ago in 1974 by scientists in Chile who wanted to know the mood of the nation at the time of the revolution. So they put up these eudometers in different places, schools, workshops, factories, farms, and anybody who entered and exited, say from a school or from a seminar hall like this, could see that eudometer, which was ranging between red and blue, and say this does not represent my state of well-being, and could change a little gadget to reflect what that person thought was the well-being of that person and the others in the school. And it was a collective exercise, curiously, because every person who changed the meter was conscious that somebody else could change it in the other direction. So it would be useful to have a eudometer here, because then the speaker would know what is the state of well-being in this audience and change the way of speaking accordingly. I must warn you that I would prefer the eudometer to swing towards a state of ill-being, because well-being means everybody is satisfied, nobody wants to change. Ill-being means there's something wrong and we need to address that. So how to bring that about, how to bring about these motivations and inspirations for change is something I will dwell upon. Now, the Dalai Lama, on the concept note that was sent to me, has enunciated these two principles, which I think are very valuable. I'll just remind the audience of them. One was the recognition of our common humanity and a shared aspiration to avoid suffering. So that's one. The second one is independence as a key feature of human reality, including ecology. So now these two principles, if I examine it in the light of my experiences over many decades, seem to resonate very well with ordinary working people's ideas and aspirations, and I will try and illustrate that. But I will also add a third principle which perhaps needs some thinking about. So let me begin with the context today, because the context is very important. Contexts are always very important. In the city of Delhi, there are 32 places where women and young students have gathered and are sitting almost every day, asking that the CAA be reconsidered, along with the NPR and the NRC. And their basic demand is, come talk with us. Humse baat karo. What is the response of many spokespersons of the party, which has formed a government? It is देश के गद्दारों को गोली मारो सालों को. Now here's a conflict. Here's a complete contextual contradiction, if you like. And I hope that young people sitting here are thinking about this. Because this is also a question of ethics. This is a question of who responds to what and in what form. Yeah? What are the values that are embedded in these two camps? So taking off from that context, that it is these conflicts, these contradictions that help us to think, help us to reflect, I will take up, well, I don't have time, but I'll give you 3 stories which might help to show how working people resonate with the 2 principles that the Dalai Lama has laid down. Now, I come from the IIT. It's a very premier institution where engineering is, the top of the thing. And we don't think of much else other than engineering. We are trained not to think. But when I graduated from IIT, there was a poster that came out. I don't expect you to remember those years. No cell phones, no Xerox, no laptops, no internet. So communications was a very big problem. No phones even, as a matter of fact. In the entire hostel, there was one payphone, and people were queuing up just to call. And of course, we were very innovative. Somebody made a hole in a 10 paisa coin, and with a wire, you could, many people could keep using that payphone. But quite apart from that, I'm giving you stories from such an era. A poster emerged at that time about the Concorde. You heard of the Concorde? This is the supersonic aircraft which was being developed. And the poster said, here are the engineers who can fly faster than sound. Where are the engineers who help us to live on the ground? Evocative, makes you think, makes you wonder about speed, about flying so fast, about what is the purpose of engineering. So these 3 stories. The first story is about a group of students and faculty from the IIT who went out to try and do something. One experience, one event was the drought in Marathwada. So they went to try and do something about the drought, to build catchment bunds which would store water. And then they discovered that all the bunds that they were designing were on land that belonged to the Sarpanch. So the question arises, who are you building these bunds for? Another very beautiful incident that is related by one of them, they went to study the forest produce in a remote area in Madhya Pradesh. They walked many miles to get into the heart of the forest, got to a hut. In that hut, as one of them remarks, the only thing that was not part of the local economy was a brass bowl. a bowl made of brass. And what was this brass bowl meant for? It was meant for offering mahua liquor to a guest. So there were 4 of them. So first one was offered in the brass bowl. Everybody had to wait until he finished. Then the brass bowl was washed and given to the second person. Now this idea that you have to share your time as well as your alcohol with other people and be mindful of everybody else is a very new experience for most of us. And the third incident was, out of thousands of such incidents, a group went to Assam to help bamboo workers, bamboo craftsmen. And they designed a very reasonable program of improving designs, finding markets for those designs, improving the lives of these bamboo craftspersons, and so on, until such time as Sanjay Ghosh, whom you may not have heard of, but who was one of the pioneers who went to Assam to do development work, was captured and murdered by the Ulfa. So the whole program collapsed. Now when incidents like this happen, it spurs people to at least reflect, to wonder what their engineering is about, what is their skill about, what is their education about. And about 10 years ago, a lot of these students and some faculty went to the director of, 15 years ago, to the director of the IIT and said, we need to start a center which devotes itself to these issues. It should not be just engineering. So finally they set up something called Sitara, which is technology for application in rural areas. I think it's about the only center in all the engineering institutions that tries to take engineering students out of their closed world. And one of the manifestations of that you may see is the protests in IIT Bombay today on one end on various social issues, and at the same time the administration of the institution, like in many other educational institutions, is saying this is not part of education. So we need to ask, what is the purpose of education? Why are we doing education? For whom? Now let me get from that to the second story. The second story happened when suddenly we were working in Madhya Pradesh. Suddenly 2 young villagers came searching for us and said, can you come to our village in Bihar? In Palamu actually. And we said, why? They said there's a dam being built there, high dam, and it's going to submerge 19 villages. And we want to know which village is going to be submerged and which village is not, because visually we can see one village is lower than the other. But when we ask the Department of Irrigation, the department says that the higher village will get submerged and the lower village will not. So they said, we want to understand this miracle of engineering. How does it happen that a lower village is not submerged but a higher village is? So we said, okay, we can help you. Can you give us the DPR? Now, as many of you will wonder, what is a DPR? A DPR is a detailed project report. But it's called DPR to confuse people, so that nobody knows what it is. So they said, where can a DPR be found? So we said, it will be there in the irrigation department. You have to go there and get a copy. And mind you, this is before the era of Xerox and cell phones. So then they said, okay, we'll figure it out. I think the bhanja of an uncle of an aunt is working in the irrigation department as a chaprasi. We'll smuggle the DPR out. So they smuggled it out page by page, painfully, got it done at the local typist, and then eventually sent us the DPR. Then we went to visit this village, this set of villages. And as we started telling them about the DPR, they kept objecting. It was in English, so we had to read it out in Hindi. They kept objecting on almost every paragraph, saying this is not probable, this is not possible, this river does not have enough water to irrigate so many thousands of hectares of land. This river carries too much silt to be able to, not fill up this dam in 10 years, and so on and so forth. So we said, okay, why don't you people develop a critique? So what do you need to do? They said, we need to understand the science behind it. So we did a 4-day workshop on how to measure land, how to measure water, how to measure silt. These are very simple techniques, nothing difficult about them. And after 4 days, we were packing up to leave. We trained about 20 youngsters in these villages. And as we were packing up to leave, they came up and said, where are you taking that? Now that, it's a little telescope which is used to measure land. I don't know if you've seen it. You may see it on the roads, PWD engineers measuring roads. It's called a dumpy level. Don't ask me why it's called dumpy, but it's called a dumpy level. And they said, you've taught us how to fight a yudh, a war, but you are taking away the astra. So it's interesting how perspectives change. That a fight over a dam is actually a war on information, on knowledge. And the instrument that generates the knowledge is a weapon. So we said, well, this is our instrument. It costs 3,000 rupees. You can buy it in Ranchi. So go and get it. So they said, okay. Early next morning, just before we were about to leave, they came. They said, here's 3,000 rupees. You go and buy it wherever you came from. You leave that behind. So there are innovative ways of thinking. They use that. They gave us, in 4 months' time, they gave us data, daily data of water flows, of silt levels, of contours. We did all the calculation and made them a small report which said that the DPR of the irrigation department is completely wrong. And if you do a cost-benefit analysis on the real data of siltation, of water flows, of submerged villages, this dam is not viable. They took one look at the Hindi report and said, returned it to us. They said, Angrezi mein likho. So we said, why? You don't understand English? They said, yes, but irrigation department does not understand Hindi. So we want a report in English, properly illustrated, properly bound, very fancy. We may not understand it, but this is what irrigation department understands. And they said, give us 3 copies. One for the irrigation department, one for the chief minister, and one for the World Bank president. And we'll send it to all 3, and we'll make sure that this dam is not built. And that dam was never built. So just to illustrate, systems of information and how knowledge is created. When people engage, when people learn how to engage. Last example, you may not have heard of Pindwara. Pindwara is a district in Rajasthan. But you must have heard of Akshardham, I'm sure. It's just across the river. Now the connection between the two is Akshardham is the biggest builder of temples. And Pindwara is the biggest producer of stone carvings, which are used in temples. And stone carving employs largely Adivasi and Dalit labor. How much more time do I have? I've run out of time, is it? Okay. Okay. So I'll wind up in another 5 minutes. Okay. So in Pindwara, these Adivasi and Dalit villages create these beautiful carvings, sculptures which you will see in any temple, pillars, arches, statuary. But it's a very poisonous business because when you carve stone, it produces dust. And technology has changed the nature of dust. Earlier it was hammer and chisel. Now it's all drills and grinders, power tools as they are called, which may have made work easier but have made the dust finer. And currently, according to government estimates, in Pindwara alone, there are about 1,700 workers who are dying of silicosis, which is silicon going into your lungs, preventing you to breathe. I don't know if you've ever seen a silicosis patient, but it's hard to see because they can't breathe. They're asphyxiating in their own lungs. By the age of 35, 40, this is the young age. So these workers came to us, they formed a Sangathan, they came to us, they said, we've been advised, and obviously who else, by the authorities, by the temple owners, by the manufacturers, that you should wear masks. So we said, what do you think is wrong with that? They said, if we wear masks, we can't work. It's painful. I would invite many of you to wear these masks. Perhaps you're trying to wear these masks for Delhi pollution. I will caution you, they don't work. They don't filter out the finer particles. But for hard-working people, it's even more difficult because you sweat. And when you sweat, the dust settles here and it itches. It's not very comfortable. You can't see the work. So we did a 4-day workshop with them on safety. What is safety? How do you prevent hazards rather than protecting the worker? This is a fundamental principle of safety. If you have a child approaching a candle, you don't put gloves on the child's hands. You blow out the candle. It's a very simple principle. So you have to adopt it in workplaces also. When we did this training, the workers said, this makes sense. We have to understand how to control hazards. So with some training from us, they did a time and motion study of about 70 factories on their own, collected data of where were the hazard spots, how much dust was being produced, who was being affected, what was the lung condition of that person who was being affected. They've got solid data today to begin arguing with factories, with labor departments, with engineers, technicians, doctors about how to remedy the conditions in these about 7,000 factories all across Rajasthan. Now, the thing with all these is you will see the parallel of Delhi being repeated, which is people begin asking questions. Young people, students, workers, and asking for proper solutions. The response of those who are responsible for resolving those problems is generally, you shouldn't be studying this. You shouldn't be asking questions. You should be studying. You should be dutiful, disciplined people of the nation. And this is an ethical problem. How do you sort it out? How do you solve it? And I say this because, and I will wind up with some very personal reflections, that it is only when you engage with reality that these questions become powerful. If you remain confined within the four walls of your college, your university, your home, your job, then these questions will always be dampened over, hampered, obstructed by a system that doesn't want these questions to be raised. I learned this because, along with some very lovely comrades, we went to this remote area and started a small mechanical workshop to repair bullock carts, cycles, diesel pump sets, the occasional truck and tractor which came along. And for 20 years, it was hard work, but it was also part of our learning process. Because through that work, we learned to engage with farmers, with workers, with people around the countryside. So if a rich farmer would come and say, please repair this diesel engine, he would often not pay. And the poor would inevitably, if they couldn't pay, they would come back with something. With some vegetables, with a chicken, something they would come back with. And that is why I say that this working experience resonates with what the Dalai Lama has enunciated as the two principles. Just to repeat those two principles about humanity. And there are two metaphors that people use that I think will appeal to you. One is having seen drought, flood, earthquake, disasters, riots of all magnitudes across the country for many, many years. I have seen that people who are affected, particularly women, say this. They say, जो हम पर गुजरी है, वो और किसी पे ना गुजरे. So what I have suffered, nobody else should have to suffer this. Now this is an expression of that principle, that we are equal in all respects. And if we suffer, at least other people should not. The second principle of this interdependence is expressed very often, and the metaphor is very interesting. It always says, ये हमारे मेहनत की कमाई है. This is the product of our labor. It's not my labor. It's always our labor. It's a collectivity. And there's a consciousness that it is our labor that creates this society. Whatever we do. So it resonates with this idea, and labor is always not only in interaction with other human beings, it is interaction with nature, with the elements. So it's a very powerful metaphor. But I would finally end up with a third metaphor that they use, which is maybe part of the principles, but which needs to be perhaps put forward. It's a metaphor called Iman. It's very difficult to translate Iman. It consists of virtue, faith, value, honesty, truth. Everything is included in this, that this is my Iman. And I will not budge from it. So how to incorporate that principle into some of these things that we are discussing is my plea to you. I don't know if this has made any impact. A Udometer would have been very useful. So thank you very much for having listened patiently. I will now go and buy my momos. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be brief so that we can have some audience discussion with the audience. I think three very interesting and very different aspects. Let me remind all of us that the session title originally framed was Ethics in the Everyday, Negotiating Difference and Indifference. I think that comes out, but perhaps we can reflect a little bit more on that. Ethics in the Everyday, clearly, negotiating difference and indifference. Just very brief remarks. First, Nidhi's presentation. Extensive research project on which you reported. The fact is there is more student diversity than in the past, though there is less faculty diversity. But there is that symbolic diversity, so to speak. It seems is not translating, maybe not surprising, into substantive diversity. There's a big literature for democracy also, symbolic democracy versus substantiation of democracy. So you've painted a very powerful picture, I think, of the fact that there is considerable diversity, partly through reservation, through many means, but somehow the picture that you painted, alienation from course content, the fact that they form their groups and don't interact, there's discrimination, there's tension. Tension is considered bad, though in this kind of context it could have been considered good, and so on. So it looks like we have a fundamental problem that you've painted as we are not managing diversity. There is diversity, and so somehow it's not being it's translated into what you had said initially, civic learning, ethics, and so on. So that I think that point came out very powerfully. I think I'd invite you to think more about where is the indifference. Is it a systemic indifference, since that's the title of the session? I think the picture of difference that you painted, how does that fit with that might be interesting to think about. And is it the case, for example, that since you're talking about higher education, in schools or departments where they study the humanities or the social sciences, which are supposed to engage in exactly the kind of thing that you're reporting, is there greater sensitivity to this? I fear not, but maybe there is. The modules, the action research component that you presented, the modules to sensitize, I think was the word you put. Initially I was wondering, is it just knowledge being transmitted? But I think it was more than that. I think the idea in those models was to create forums for some kind of interaction. How does that work? There seems to be the effort to manage diversity to make it civic learning. It appears to be stupendously, it's a stupendous project. So maybe more on that. How did those interaction sessions go when you went with those modules? Because I think in the previous session also, Anita, you mentioned the Good Samaritan study where just telling them about a parable doesn't help. It's actually having to change the circumstances, the situation within which we operate. So those are my quick thoughts on that. For Deshan's presentation, I think you made a very clear statement about of the need for water. Much of it is locked up. Fresh water is locked up in glaciers. Climate change is creating various issues. Also impacts India. You mentioned some water tower of Asia. I think it was a fairly clear picture of a brewing crisis. Maybe I found the examples you gave. Initially, you mentioned it as individual responsibility. You used that concept quite a bit. That father-son lama doing stuff, but you also mentioned that there was a considerable amount of indifference. And so the challenge of their organization was to communicate this reality, a sense of urgency. So I guess I'm wondering, since you mentioned individual responsibility, which is a term also mentioned in some of the morning sessions, how does that convert to collective responsibility? In this case, we're talking about eventually, water policy and so on. It will have eventually that responsibility will have to get reflected, in the kinds of decisions, to mitigate climate change, right? So that's a big question, I know, but from individual responsibility, these two individuals and their work, how does that spread? How was it diffused into the collective? And I think we saw some answers with the third presentation on this. So yeah, so my question is really from individual to collective. What's the process in the specific case that you were discussing, and where is the indifference? So I just want to drag it back to the title, because I think it's a very interesting title, navigating, negotiating difference and indifference. So because you did paint a picture of indifference, right? So from individual to collective, and that would be the way to navigate around the indifference. So any thoughts on that? So. And Dunu Roy's powerful three stories. The social scientist in me was trying to look for, what's one simple thread to tie these together. But of course, it'll involve jargon and so on. I think the stories should speak for themselves. But I did find that all of these stories were stories of, forgive me for jargon, structural violence. The first of these engineers being trained in a system, in a structure, which actually encouraged them not to look out. And so that was the story of a few of them who did manage to look out, who went to these places and engaged. So there is some kind of structure which prevents freedom, something like that. And here is a band of people who managed to somehow overcome. Maybe it's a small minority in these situations. So an exercise of individual responsibility in a situation of structural violence, I thought. And I thought that's true in the second case as well. The dam which eventually did not get built in Bihar, and the pursuit of the DPR and the reports and so on. So there it was this band of IITians interacted with the villagers, but much of the story was about how the villagers took it up, right? Collected money, did this, that, insisted on changing the report. So there was a story, I thought, in there of definitely structural violence, the unresponsive irrigation department with its ridiculous plan, which was not thought out. But there was a story of agency, of individual responsibility, transforming into actually collective. So there was some kind of diffusion, it seems. I don't know how you could manage that in a few days, because of course there's much more to these stories than you presented. But I think that's fascinating, how a few of these people, right? Somehow, maybe those villagers were already very much charged up and they brought you. So I guess there was already collective responsibility in the making in that story. Same with the third, the Pindwara story, where again, structural violence, in this case economic, some kind, unregulated capitalism at work, right? And again, in that story of structural violence, there are these, people who go there, who are invited there, who go there. There is that interaction between the outsiders, the interested outsiders, and the locals, and they train them in data collection. They go. So I see that diffusion story, so to speak, in that a story of collective responsibility. And I think in all your stories, the indifference is very clear. I might even say the indifference is structural, right? The IIT system, or whichever the system that you went through, right, was indifferent to the purpose of education, which is what you're questioning. The irrigation department was indifferent. And so these are all stories actually of navigating, using individual agency, individual and then collective responsibility to actually navigate indifference. But the interesting thing for me is that the indifference is embedded in the structure, right? Large structures often tend to be indifferent, right? Hence, maybe the inclination for decentralization. For small is beautiful, because so I think in all these structures that you mentioned, there is indifference because it's embedded in some invisible structure far away. So I thought in many ways these presentations talk to each other and to the business at hand, which is negotiating difference and indifference. We have a little bit of time, so maybe. And there's no lunch waiting, so we can, I think, have a fair bit of discussion. Please.
Like you showed in your presentation, that majority of the students in the higher education are from the backward castes or backward classes. But the same trend is not true in case of teachers. I mean, majority of the teachers in higher education are from the higher classes, higher castes. So I have 3 small questions on that. Why is it actually a source of concern? Like you said, it's a source of concern. And what can be the possible reasons for this trend? Like teachers from higher caste occupy the majority. And what is your remedy on that? And one is for Ms. Palmu, ma'am. Ma'am, like your whole presentation revolved around, you explained about the individual efforts towards the Tibetan rivers. So what has been the effort of the Tibetan government so far, if we, in reaching out to its rivers?
Thank you. Two quick responses. One is about what you raised about our modules and all. So the way we are, it is an ambitious project, and we are progressing in the sense we prepared modules, and since the National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration is situated in a space where there is training also happens, and there are departments who are engaged in training of faculty and administrators who are looking after, say, for example, equal opportunity offices and other institutional mechanism. So in that context, these modules are being sort of transacted. They will be transacted. We are preparing it, but they will be transacted with these faculty members and administrators in order for them to understand what is the challenge to begin with, and how one can best, and what are the principles of the ways of addressing this through curricular intervention, say new knowledge, because our study also finds that, for example, the syllabus and the reference list does not include references from those social groups or from authors that are not the mainstream authors, or not. So the knowledge is missing at that time. And also the kind of pedagogy happens, it's a lecture method. Inside the classroom, the kind of the way peer group interaction takes place for assignments, that's very based on identity. So we are proposing for mixed peer groups for activities inside classroom, intergroup dialogues, and of course university community partnerships. So these are principles, and each institutions are then are free to implement the way they would want, because each state also, that's identity, or students who are marginalized are also different. So for example, in Maharashtra, it's the denotified tribes, the erstwhile criminal tribes. These are the students who may be those who are disadvantaged. So each region will need to address their own way, but we are preparing the principles around which these interventions can be implemented. In terms of your question on faculty members, it becomes a source of tension, because what we found in our study was that we asked this question: do you, from students from the disadvantaged? I mean, we asked this question from everyone, but it was more likely students replying and feeling that the faculty member from their background gave them more attention. That's where the tension lies. The higher education institutions are still elite in nature. The structures remain elite. The teaching learning process remains very elite. It becomes only lecture method, or in that context, students who we spoke with, they were not able to relate to what is being taught in the classroom or how they are being engaged within the classroom. So they were feeling alienated from the classroom transaction. Why faculty member representation is low? There are many issues around that, but one of the aspects which have been documented is about how there is this discriminatory access at the time of recruitment too.
What's your remedy?
Sorry?
I mean, what's your possible remedy?
To start with, implement the law. There is reservation in the faculty, so implement the law. That's the beginning to begin with.
Hello, it's working? Yeah, it's audible now. Okay, talking about Tibet, and since like Tibet is under Chinese control, and Tibetan over there doesn't have any authority over to decide what to do with the rivers and environment of Tibet. So China having control over Tibet, they like as of now, Tibet being the water tower of Asia, as I've mentioned, but they have never signed any kind of treaty, transboundary water treaty with any of the nation. So even though United Nations, they have formed UN Water Course Convention in 1997, if I'm not wrong, 1997, but China, they are the one of the three countries who have voted against this. So China, as of now, they haven't signed any kind of international treaty. So they are not bound to any kind of a treaty. So they have been exploiting Tibetan resources by building so many dams. Like China, they have the largest number of dams in the world. So there were around 97,000 dams built in China. So they have the largest number of dams. And beside this, from India, Tibetan government in exile from side, like we from our desk, Environment Development Desk from Tibet Policy Institute, we have been participating UN Conference of Parties (COP) since 2008, and over there we keep on raising the issues of Tibet and importance of Tibet and the issue which need to discuss at the global platform. So Tibetan, as of now, like the discussion of Tibetan plateau and the environment are missing. So like since 2008 we have been raising this and promoting and the importance of Tibetan plateau all over the importance of Tibetan plateau to the world. So we have like in recent COP 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So we have been participating in all this conference, and we call for 5-point call for action, where we ask the government leaders who have gathered there to recognize the importance of Tibetan plateau, and then we ask to respect the we ask Chinese government not to exploit the resources which we have in Tibetan plateau and respect the Tibetan tradition and customs over there. So it is China Chinese government who are not taking the initiative of working for the whole of humanity, but for their own concern, on kind of their own. They are thinking only about the development which they without concerning what is happening to the downstream countries. So China's government, they have been building so many dams, and even beside this, Chinese government, Yeah, that's the main point. And even His Holiness Dalai Lama, he have been like he have also attended COP first COP summit, which is happened in Rio in 1992 in Rio, and raised the significance of Tibetan plateau over there. So that's the main thing. Thank you.
Hello. My question is to Dr. Niti Sabharwal. So, could you comment a little bit on the difference in outcomes between students of higher caste and lower caste in educational institutions? One, and the second question is, how much of the unlearnables that has been unteachables is perceived is sort of a perceived imagination of the professors instead of actuality, because a lot of times you go to college, the learning abilities are not always reflective of the marks that you obtain during entrance examinations and stuff. So how much of that is perceived in the sense that comparing that to the actual outcomes of students in colleges? That is second. And what about the diversity in this university administration? Have you worked on that, or what are the figures about university administration? Thank you.
If you would like to see tables and figures and everything, and the graphs, you'll find we have given, because it was a large scale study, 3,200 students. We looked at their academic outcomes in terms of the marks that they had when they came into higher education institutions, and what were their marks when they were transiting from the first year to the second year. So all of that is there in this, and you'll see the graphs and everything, and you see that what we found, what we figured out, and from our data set, the analysis was that the students from the disadvantaged groups, because the teaching learning process inside classroom is so alienating and is not inclusive, they fall in a low performance trap. It is a consequence. The low performance trap, the low grades that they keep getting, they come. Of course, the issue is that the point of entry is relaxed for them, right? But the point of exit requires similar marks, so that's not relaxed for them. So it's the same. It's a similar marks that they would require. So this distance that they have to traverse from the point of entry to point of exit it becomes magnified for them vis-a-vis those who are from the privileged background with medium of instruction in English. It is more likely that students from the disadvantaged groups are coming in higher education classrooms with medium of instruction in the regional language. That becomes a barrier. So this is available online. It's a public good. It's not charged, so you can download and understand the issues of disparities in academic outcomes as well.
I think if the organizer, I think there's some material from the previous session too, which is worth circulating. So that might be something I think you also have a lot to circulate. So that's something to keep in mind.
I have two questions. One is for Dr. Sabharwal. You said there were interventions done with awareness programs and many modules for the teachers and the administrators. It's being prepared. Okay, it hasn't been. So I was just going to ask, what was the consequence of these various projects? I was at a talk where they have in Bihar, where they found this kind of disparity. They removed the last names of the children from the list. So if the teacher didn't know the last name of the child, they couldn't place the caste of the child. They found amazing results. The children from low castes did as well as or better than the other castes, because they were now not saddled by a last name, so everyone didn't know what caste they came from. So that's why I was curious about that. And for Mr. Roy, I have a question. You said that the Pindwara workers didn't want to wear masks. So you said also that you developed something that could be done from the perspective of safety, from the work perspective, right? Which is not wearing masks, but something. So one, what was that was done that could have helped them for not wearing masks? And two, a lot of people don't want to wear helmets, for example. I mean, it's really beneficial for them, but they don't want to wear helmets. So do we then say to them, okay, you don't wear helmets, but we will change the traffic situation so that you don't get hurt? As doctors, we don't want to wear masks either. I mean, I feel always if I wear a mask, my patient doesn't see my face and the empathy doesn't come through. But I do have to wear a mask if I'm doing certain procedures. So do we then just say, okay, you don't want to wear it, so just don't wear it? Is that possible? Is the other question.
This question has to be addressed in the discipline. It's not working. Good. Hello. The question has to be addressed in the frame of a discipline. There's a discipline for safety. It's taught. And this discipline emerges from experience. And basically the discipline says the following, that if any person is affected by any pollutant, hazard, accident, etc., the root must be removed. So it's like Delhi pollution. We can all wear masks, but that does not solve the problem because the pollution is out there in the air. So you have to remove the pollution. You cannot just get everybody to wear masks. Masks, in fact, are the last resort. It's only in a situation where you cannot do anything. Then the mask has to be worn, and the mask has to be worn for that particular purpose, not for any other. So in the case of doctors, one can imagine, for surgeries, actually the mask is as much for the protection of the patient as it is for the protection of the doctor. But for work of this kind, it doesn't make sense for anybody who's working an 8-hour shift, 10-hour shift to be constantly working with any kind of a mask. So therefore something has to be done about where the hazard is emerging from. And it's fairly simple, it's not complex at all. You put what we call a shroud on the tool. You mask the tool, not the person, right? And from that mask, you extract the dust with a vacuum. So the dust doesn't go out into the atmosphere, it's a transparent shroud so that the worker can see the work, and the dust just gets extracted out. The problem with this is, of course, from the point of view of the owner, because then the owner will have to invest in tools, shrouds, vacuum systems, a filter at the end of the vacuum system. No manufacturer wants to do this. They would prefer to pass on the cost to the worker. Say, you buy masks and wear them. It's cheaper for the manufacturer. So it's what he's talking about, structural violence. This is how it works out. You know, you always pass on the cost to the weakest. And until and unless the weakest learns that this is the cost we are paying, they are not likely to rebel, shall I say, against.
Sorry. Others, we have about 5-8 minutes.
Can I quickly, just in terms of the last name thing, see the issue, the way we understand, and the issue is that not about not having a last name. It's about that name should not be perceived as falling in a higher social order or a lower social order. So the hierarchy in the last names is something that's the issue. That's the problem. The second aspect is about that former untouchables are considered unteachable in the classroom. That was a perception that teachers had. That means, and from that, what we are proposing in our modules is, and what we are proposing, we don't need financial resources for that. We need care. What we really need from the faculty members in higher education classrooms is just empathy and care, which does not require financial resources to implement these principles and values.
No, I just wanted to make one very short comment on this name issue. See, teachers are not fools, and they're all high caste teachers. They can recognize children without names. I mean, in Delhi, for instance, the teacher recognizes a child by the cleanliness of the cloth. Poor people cannot afford to wash their children's clothes every day. So just by looking at how dirty the uniform is, the teacher can make out, and punish the child for not coming to school with a clean shirt without inquiring about why the shirt is not clean. So that care and empathy is a very problematic issue because it's structural again. And I just kind of felt that maybe I've been too harsh just by talking engineering. See, actually, this is not just exclusive to engineering. It's true of all disciplines, whether it's anthropology, sociology, economics. So I don't want to frighten you by saying only engineers learn. No. Everybody learns. It depends on context. And a little example of that, I met an SBI bank in charge who was working in Koraput. I met him on a bus ride. He said, I have a major problem. People there are not investing their savings in the bank. I'm the lead bank. Can you help us find out? So we sent 6 anthropology students from Cuttack University to go into Koraput for 4 weeks. They came back a shattered lot. Because Koraput, I don't know if any of you have been to Koraput, even today. I mean, there are no savings. People survive from one meal to the next. So for anthropology students who went in with this perception that we'll help the bank to get savings into the bank, came back with the lesson that there are no savings. So the issue is, are people to be designed according to institutions? Or are institutions to be designed according to people? So this lesson can be learned irrespective of discipline, of background, of skill, but it just requires a deal of desire to learn.
Others? I'll take a 1-minute filler, then others. Going back to something that Dunu mentioned earlier, it is important to specify the context, and you did it short in a brief but very eloquent way. Just to repeat what you said about the CA and the 32 places in Delhi where this thing. Humse baat karo, the way you put it is, I think this is relevant from the perspective of universal ethics that we are discussing over 2 days. So asking for dialogue, and in the way you put it, on the other side, the discourse is Gaddar and Goli, right? Not just for this particular case, but maybe that's a metaphor of concern for those, when we discuss universal ethics. Yeah, humse baat karo. So the women and these groups in these peaceful protests are simply saying, please talk to us, please enter into dialogue. And the way he put it was from the side of the uncaring state, you are traitors, and we will pump you with bullets. So that's a very violent metaphor, not just, I mean, this is violent reality, but also I think a metaphor which is useful. I'm pointing out because this idea of dialogue, maybe we'll talk more about it in coming sessions, as perhaps inherent or embedded in a notion of universal ethics. Um, um, it's all a matter of finding out. A universal ethic is probably not given, right? So dialogue seems key, and in the way you put it. And I thought also, I think you mentioned perhaps briefly courage. Maybe there's something to be said for an ethic of courage, a term used in one of the in the previous session too. So where does courage belong? Even when things are against you structurally, right? Maybe care is needed in showing courage, but courage as a value, as a universal ethic. I thought both dialogue and courage came out in that very brief example. So yeah, one final, yes, please.
Thank you for the wonderfully humbling talk that all of you gave. So the question I have is related to structural violence, which you talked about. When there is structural violence, when there are structures in place which keep certain people out, there are also these structures are also present and continue to persist because there are winners in these structures. So, for example, there are the teachers in the higher education institutes from the higher castes are benefiting. There are government officials benefiting with the lack of responsiveness they execute with, or the Chinese government itself has benefits from the from the exploitation in the Tibetan plateau. So there are winners in this structures which are present, and one of the key concerns and the most difficult part perhaps is that when these structures of violence are being resisted by, let's say, the losers, the winners are not going to let it go easy. There's going to be resistance from the Chinese government, from the teachers of the higher caste who are going through, let's say, workshops or something like that. So one of the questions is, how does one deal with it? What is key to it? And my own thought somewhere is that there is this disconnect between, let's say, the winners and the losers. For example, let's say there's this disconnect between the worker and the employee, something which Marx also professes about. And it is this lack of connectedness that actually perpetuates or lets this thing perpetuate. But how does one get over that lack of connectedness? That itself is a big task, because once the problem is identified, I mean, solving that problem is also not that easy. So that was my brief question.
Big and profound question. We have some wonderful examples, big examples from the 20th century of non-violent revolutions, right? The Gandhian freedom struggle, the struggle against apartheid, Martin Luther King's civil rights movement. We have some great examples that we are all familiar with in some ways or the other. The Dalai Lama's own example, an ongoing struggle of sorts, right? So I think there are so many high-profile examples to reflect on, may not fully address, and there are so many smaller examples we might each know from our own little context, right, which may not make this kind of macro headline. So maybe that's one place to start. Of course, each has its own dynamic. I mean, people have commented, for example, that a Gandhian a civil disobedience movement would not have worked against the Nazis, for instance. It worked against a certain kind of structural violence, the British regime. And so there's probably a lot to parse out there, but this is not just theory. We have great examples, big and small. But others?
Well, personally, I'm very happy. I won't be around to answer this question. You'll have to find your own answers, which is very comforting. But I think when we use language, we need to, I'm just suggesting, we need to focus on what it is that we are trying to understand. So if we are saying structural violence, somehow or the other it's the word violence that begins resounding in our brains. And we begin to think of, okay, violence, so the answer must be non-violence. In some ways, this is how we are taught. Problem, answer, problem, answer. So problem, violence, so answer has to be non-violence. I would urge you to look at the structure instead, rather than the violence. What is the structure that does not produce violence? That is the key question. And how do we focus our thinking on that rather than on the issue of violence alone? Because until and unless that structure becomes clearer in our minds, we are only, in a sense, contesting violence. We are not, see again, this is the same thing about safety and hazard. If you're only looking at the hazard, we are not looking at what caused the hazard. So we would need to look at what causes that violence. What is the structure? Why is that structure living and so generic in nature? And what is needed to contest that? And to some extent, this what he highlighted of humse baat karo, there is underlying it a sense of solidarity. When they say, mujhse nahi baat karo, humse baat karo. See, this is the collectivity at work. So you're creating a structure where you're not saying individuals are going to be accountable. It's we, collectively, who will answer, who will find answers, who will move forward. So somewhere or the other we've lost sense, if I may be permitted to say so, of the collectivity that we are born into, because our education teaches us individualism. We have to somehow, break that, and that starts everywhere, in school, in college, in family. It has to be addressed. Sorry.
I think then we'll end it there. Did you have a question, comment? Okay, maybe this is the very last. Please go ahead.
My question is to Duno Roy, sir. Thank you for the very insightful talk. I just wanted to know your thoughts on the following question. So, will I be right in saying that there are no good and bad people, but there are just people who are willing to engage and those that aren't? Willing to engage in terms of people who are willing to engage in terms of other identities, in terms of engaging with people of other ideologies, or just sitting down with people who are different from you. Thank you.
Probably the latter, because good and bad come to us from what we are told. But the moment we are engaging, then in a sense good and bad start disappearing. Isn't it? Because then you are engaging with an unknown, you are trying to grapple with it. And that then breeds a certain different set of values. But this willingness is again I focus on words. Willingness to engage. Sometimes willingness does not come from your own agency. Willingness is imposed on you from what you see around you. You may not be willing to sit next to a dirty person, but if you are sitting next to a dirty person, eventually you have to engage. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. We'll, yeah.
Thank you, everybody. To wrap up this session, I want to give you a little bit takeaway from today's session. So first of all, let us be kinder towards everybody. From the first session, we said Einstein's optical illusion of I and you. So let us break this barrier and be one. The common humanity that we have just discussed. And with universal ethics, this also includes not only I'm not hurting anybody, I'm not beating animals, and I'm a good universal ethics practitioner, but also let us also look at the environment aspect of it, because even environment also affects all sentient beings. For example, we just had water during this lunch, so most of us, I think, how many of us have finished all water and thrown the plastic bottle? We all have, I think, some of us have finished only half and then thrown the whole bottle, which is also a waste of water and a waste of plastic bottle. So I think universal ethics is, as it says, universal, including both human being, human behavior, and also for environment. Thank you. And lastly, in one word, I would like to combine Dr. Sadiqji's and Venerable Geshe-La's word. Let us have good manners, starting from our home. Thank you. Now I would like to request Professor Sadiq Wahidji to kindly offer khada and souvenir to our chairperson and speakers. Dr. Suraj Jacobji, our chairperson. Mr. Danuji, our speaker. Miss Dr. Nidila. Sorry. And Miss Deche Pamula, our speaker. Thank you, Dr. Sadiq-ji. I would like to thank our guest of honor speakers and everyone joining us with us today. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for giving us your time. We have a tea break from tea waiting outside our hall. Please join with us. And after 4:35, we have a film screening on Dalai Lama scientist. The filmmaker is Dawn Eagle. Please join with us for session 3. Thank you.